Hi there! By now your understanding of the middle game strategy and planning is much better when compared to most of your current opponents. After the 7th lesson, the gap in your middle game skills and your opponents will become so huge that it's gonna be really difficult for your opponents to compete with you. The lesson is called The Main Middle Game Plan Unknown by Amateur Players. In the previous lessons we analyzed that in the middle game you can mainly attack two targets, either opponent's king or his pawns. Very often attack of opponent's king is impossible, and then you have to shift to the pawns. We analyzed a couple of typical middle game pawn structures where opponent had a certain pawn weakness which you could eventually attack. But what if your opponent does not have any pawn weaknesses? What should you do then? This is a really important question because actually this is the most common middle game situation and you need to know what to do then. I'm pretty sure that you have seen the plan we're going to talk about very often in the games of Grandmasters. However, it's much different to just see something and to be able to do that yourself. To be able to play such brilliant chess yourself, you need to have very good understanding of this strategy. Rest assured, you will have it by the end of this lesson. So, let's find out. This position is just for illustrative purposes. It's not a real game. Once again, the question is, how can you attack opponent's pawns if he doesn't have any weaknesses? Before we answer that question, let's clarify what a weakness is. A weakness is opponent's pawn which cannot be protected by other pawns. Why is that so? Well, let's think how you can possibly attack opponent's pawn. Firstly, let's try to attack opponent's pawn by your own pawn. Therefore, white pushes his pawn forward and attacks opponent's pawn. Guess what's gonna happen? Well, black will capture that pawn himself, and then at best, that's gonna be an exchange of pawns, or maybe white will even lose his pawn. Therefore, you cannot really attack and capture opponent's pawn by your own pawn. They have equal power, and therefore it's not enough resources for you to make a successful attack. You can only attack and capture opponent's pawn with your piece. Like in this position, this is a knight, although it can easily be any other piece, a bishop, queen, rook, or your king. In such case, it's very straightforward. You can just go ahead and capture opponent's pawn and win material, which is great for you. And that is why it is so important for you that the pawn is unprotected by other pawns. In this position, although knight is still attacking the d6 pawn, there is nothing white can do because the pawn is protected by another pawn. And so if white really tries to go ahead and capture that pawn, nothing good is going to happen because white will lose the knight, which is more valuable than a pawn, and therefore that's not an option for white. That's why we say that a pawn is weak when it cannot be protected by other pawns. And we already analyzed a number of such situations. We were talking about isolated pawns, double pawns, advanced pawns, but in all of those cases the main characteristic was that the pawn could not be protected by other pawns, or at least it is very hard to do that. Here you may have another question, like in the given example, what about that pawn on c7? It's not protected by other pawns of black, so can we consider it to be weak? Well, not really, because actually if we just imagine the starting position of the chess game, then all of the pawns are standing there on the home rank. Like in this position, all of the black pawns are standing on the home rank. Of course they are not protected by other pawns because by the chess rules black cannot place his pawns on the 8th rank. Anyway, we do not call those pawns weak just because they are so close to black's army, and all these pawns are very well supported by black's pieces. On the contrast, these pawns are far away from white's pieces, and for white it's gonna be a very long way to approach those pawns and be able to attack them. And therefore, although those pawns are not protected by other pawns, if they stand on their original square, in most of the cases they are not weak because they cannot be really attacked. To summarize, we say that the pawn is weak when it is not protected by other pawns, when there are no pawns that can protect it, and at the same time when the pawn has made at least one move. Like in this position, the d6 pawn is really a weakness and white can attack it effectively. Okay, now let's move on. So when opponent has a weak pawn, your plan is very straightforward, you can go ahead and attack it. Hopefully you'll capture it, gain material advantage, and then you'll be able to convert it into win. But what should you do if opponent does not have any weaknesses? In the original position of a chess game, your opponent has his pawns standing together and they are ready to protect each other. If your opponent is an experienced player, he will not weaken his pawns by himself and he will keep them strong, like in the current position on the chessboard. Currently, there is nothing white can attack here really, because the e5 pawn is protected by the d6 pawn, and the d6 pawn is protected by the pawn on c7. Although the pawn on c7, the base of this pawn chain, is not protected by other pawns, we already agreed that it's too close to black's army, and therefore, in most of the cases, white will be unable to do anything about it. Bottom line, there is nothing white can do about this pawn chain. Sadly, this is the most typical situation that you'll have to face in the middle game. How should you deal with it? Here comes the main middle game plan, which is so widely used by grandmasters and so largely misunderstood or underestimated by club level players. In this case, you need to break up the opponent's pawn chain firstly. And you do that by pushing your own pawn and undermining opponent's pawn chain. Now white is going to take on d6 and then to capture this pawn by his piece. Therefore black has to react, he has to do something. And in case he trades off the pawn, then after this exchange, white reached his goal. White managed to split up opponent's pawns. Now they're isolated, and these two pawns, and especially the advanced e5 pawn, will be a convenient target for the white's attack. Now if you start looking at the games of the world top players, having this plan in mind, you will see that they realize this plan almost always in their games. They're pushing their pawns, undermining opponent's pawn chain, creating weaknesses, and then attacking them. Let's see how that works in a practical game. Here's the game between Tigran Petrosyan playing white and black player is Letjier Martner. Let's think how white can attack opponent's pawns here. Firstly, we can see that the vast majority of the opponent's pawns are standing on the home rank, and as we already decided, normally you cannot attack them because they are too distant from your pieces. The only advanced pawns that can possibly become a target for your attack are those pawns on d5 and c6. But the problem for you here is that black has this ideal classical pawn chain of three pawns standing together protecting each other, and therefore white cannot attack effectively these pawns right away. What he needs to do is to undermine this pawn chain first, to break up the pawns and create some weaknesses. That's exactly what he did by pushing his b pawn forward. He's going to play b5, destroy this pawn chain, and then start attacking it by his pieces. Let's see what happened next. Black played a6, white maneuvered his knight to c5 to a more advanced square, and then continued his plan with pushing the pawns forward and creating weaknesses in the black's position. This plan is called pawn minority attack because originally on the queen side white had 2 pawns against 3 pawns of black, and that's why it is called pawn minority attack. The good thing for white here with the pawn minority, when you have fewer pawns than your opponent on a certain wing of a chessboard, is that you have some open lines that you can use for the attack. In this position, white is planning to exchange on c6, and after that it's really great for white that the c-file is open and he can use his queen and also his rook in the future to pressurize the c6 pawn and to capture it afterwards. If you imagine that white has his own white's pawn somewhere on c3, for example, you can see that it would be a lot harder for white to attack black's pawn on c6. And that's why the pawn minority attack is so effective. Anyway, let's see what happened in the game. Black decided to change the situation a little. He played b6 to kick off the knight, and then took the pawn. After that, we can see that white successfully realized the first part of his plan. He broke up black's pawns, and now all of them are isolated and weak. So black has isolated pawn on d5 and double pawns on the b line. Now all of them are easy targets for the white's attack. And that's exactly what he started to do. He played knight d4, taking the d5 pawn and threatening knight to c6. I played queen d6, I traded off the bishops and just started to attack those weak pawns directly. Right now you can see that the pawn on d5 is attacked, the b5 pawn is attacked, and all those pawns are going to crumble fast. And black collapsed pretty soon. White won this game afterwards, so very easily without any problems. He just captured those pawns one after the other. I will not show this game until the end. You will be able to check it out in the practical part of the course. Let's just review once again what happened in this game. At the beginning of the middle game, white realized that opponent's king is well protected and there is no way for white to attack it. That's why white knew that he had to attack opponent's pawns. The opponent's pawn chain was very strong and there was no way for white to attack it right away. Therefore, he decided to push his pawn to undermine opponent's pawns first and attack it then. That's exactly what he did by playing b4 and then pushing this pawn forward to b5, trading off the pawns, creating weaknesses, and then he attacked those weaknesses, captured them, and won the game. This is a classical pawn minority attack, and it's a very effective plan. The one important note I'd like to make here is that the plan of pawn minority attack is quite known for chess players, and especially in this pawn structure. But somehow people don't understand that exactly the same plan works not only here, but in the vast majority of the other situations. First of all, it does not necessarily have to be a pawn minority attack. So even if you would imagine that white has his pawn somewhere on c5, in that case there would be no minority for white on the queen side. We would have 3 pawns of white against 3 pawns of black, and still white could realize the same plan to push b4, b5, then trade it on c6, create that pawn weakness on c6 and attack it then. Therefore, it does not have to be a pawn minority attack, and it does not have to be exactly the same pawn structure. But this plan of pushing your pawn, undermining opponent's pawn chain, creating weakness and attack it then, works in many different situations. Let's just check out another example where the situation will be very different. Here is another game. It is black to move now, and I would like to ask you to think about the position and to tell me how would you play here as black. Please think about that. You may pause the video for a moment, think about that, and then resume the video. In the game, black used the same plan of undermining opponent's pawn chain. Black pushed the a pawn forward, she played a4, with the intention to destroy the white's pawn chain and create some weaknesses. Another good thing about advancing your pawn on the edge of the board, I mean the a pawn or h pawn, is that you can also activate your rook without doing anything special for that. So the rook will become active on its original place. Like after exchanging on the b3, the rook will have and control the a file. If white takes on a4 by himself, then after this exchange the rook will also be activated very nicely. It will pressurize the 2 weak pawns of white, and also it can possibly play rook a3 in the future, and things are just awesome for black. In the game, white did something different, so let's check out the actual game. After black played a4, white replied with bishop f1. Black played queen b4. She could take on b3 right away. Queen b4 doesn't change the situation too much. And then after some attacking attempts of white, black took on b3. And here, if white takes, you can see that the first stage of black's plan was realized successfully. Now white has this new weakness in b3, which black can attack. In addition to that, white still has the isolated pawn on d4, which is weak. And white even pushed some pawns on the king side, and therefore he has some advanced pawns there, which are also weak. Now white has weaknesses all around the board, and it's very easy for black to attack him. For instance, black can go rook e8, attacking the queen, and since queen has to protect the rook, they'll probably go there. And then after exchange on f5, there is a little bit combination that black can use to win the game right now. Can you spot it? It's bishop takes f5, deflecting the queen from defense, and then black can capture the rook, getting decisive material advantage, and it's totally winning for black. Let's recall the starting position of this example. In this situation, black decided to go for that plan of pushing her pawn forward to undermine white's pawn chain and then attack those weaknesses. She realized this plan successfully, and white couldn't hold all of his weaknesses. There was another extra motif here. While pushing the a-pawn, black also managed to activate her rook on a8, which was another benefit for black. The last thing I'd like to mention here is that while pushing your pawn forward, like in this case when black pushed a4, the main purpose is to weaken opponent's pawns, to create those weaknesses that you can attack later on. But there is another good thing for you as well. When you push your pawn, you blockade opponent's pawn. For instance, in this position, if we just take a move back, white could eventually advance his pawn forward to a3 or to a4 in the future. And if black pushes her pawn to a4, then there is nothing white can do anymore. So these two pawns are now fixed. They cannot really move forward because the black's pawn on a4 is limiting them, and they can't really go forward that much. That's the extra benefit for black, because if the target of your attack is fixed, immobile, it's very easy for you to attack. You can bring more and more pieces, and you know exactly when this weakness is. You know that it cannot run away, your opponent cannot replace it somewhere, and you can attack it very conveniently. So far, everything sounds very logical, doesn't it? However, there is a trick here. In fact, that move a4 was not the best in the position. True, in a middle game we need to either attack opponent's king or pawns, and in this position black needs to attack white's pawns. However, no matter what your target is, you gotta be a center forward player. Do you still remember Cristiano Ronaldo? That's why, if you want to make some attack on a side, you need to make sure that you have good control over center squares first. And only once you managed to establish a good control over the central squares, only then you may start some active actions on the side. That's why in this position, the right way for black would be to firstly bring his rook in the center to make sure that black controls the center well enough, and only then black could eventually go back to that plan with pushing the a-pawn forward. For instance, black could play that move queen b4 and then play a4. So I'm not saying that the plan itself was wrong. Pushing a4 was a good idea, but it was prematurely played in the game. Because black should have prepared it, black should have placed his pieces in the center first. In the game, the black's plan succeeded, but only because white played too passively. If you imagine that white instead would start creating some troubles for black and putting his pieces in the center, then you can easily see that black would start experiencing some troubles. How can black protect that f6 pawn now? Like if black plays bishop e7, white can go knight c5, and the queen can come into e7 or maybe to e6 and start disturbing black. So you could see that black eventually could have some troubles. If if white would be playing better. To conclude, whenever you want to move your pawn on a side, always firstly make sure that you have good enough control in the center. Conclusions. In the middle game, you need to either attack opponent's king or his weak pawns. If there are no weaknesses, push your pawn to undermine opponent's pawn chain. So basically these are two main things which are guidelines for your middle game play. If there are no weaknesses in the opponent's position, you need to create them. Now, we call a weakness a pawn which cannot be protected by other pawns. If opponent has a healthy pawn chain where every pawn is protecting each other, then you need to undermine it. Therefore, you push your pawn forward and undermine opponent's pawn chain, break it up, and you can attack it later on. While pushing your pawn and undermining opponent's chain, you achieve two main goals. The primary goal is to create weaknesses, and the additional goal is to blockade opponent's pawns so that they cannot go forward and therefore cannot reposition themselves and make it harder for you to attack them. Congratulations! Now you know one of the main middle game plans, which is widely used by grandmasters and so much misunderstood or understood badly by club level players. Congratulations with this nice fact. Now you will be able to realize this plan yourself against your opponents and win many games easily.